So with no further ado, I'm honored to introduce my guest this evening, Professor Lyn Spillman of the Department of Sociology at Notre Dame. Professor Spillman is... Professor Spillman is an acclaimed sociologist working across various fields, but especially within cultural sociology, and has recently written the book on cultural sociology, what is cultural sociology, which we'll talk a bunch about this evening. She has so many accolades that it would take the entire time if I read through all of them. I'll mention Lyn has won a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's served in many important roles in the American Sociological Association, and she's currently a faculty fellow of the Center for Cultural Sociology at Yale University, among many accolades. Lyn, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for letting me talk about my favorite subject. It's too few people know about sociology, and I think the sociological imagination can be maybe not quite as engaging as listening to jazz and listening to Stephen talk about what's going on, but it's definitely completely absorbing. And I was looking at all my bookshelves and all the great things that I've got on them before I came, and I thought, wow, if I can just channel like 1% of that, I'd love to do that. It's a really great subject.
Right. So, and indeed, in your book, you compile an enormous amount of knowledge and research on this field. From all of those sources, certainly. And so I think I would be remiss if I were to ask as my first question, well, what is cultural sociology? Now that you've synthesized for us all of these writings.
I'll say one thing, and then I want to take a step back to situate it, because I think it needs a little bit of an introduction. So I say cultural sociology is about human meaning making. We all exist in a world of meanings. Where do they come from? Why do they vary? Etc. That's at an abstract level. But let me take a step back first and say, this is a series about science. How does this fit in here? Well, we're one of the social sciences. The social sciences that probably get more publicity would be economics and psychology. There's a few others in there as well. People don't know sociology so much. But sociology, if you think of psychology as about mental processes, cognitive, emotional development, etc. Sociology is about all the social relationships and the social groups which affect us as humans. And we have lots of questions, and we want to research answers to the questions about all those interrelationships which we're all embedded in one way or another. So whereas psychology might be about mental processes, sociology is about all our interrelationships at many different levels. Okay, so like every field, there's little subfields. You have little subfields in physics, right? And my particular subfield is cultural sociology, and that means that I'm particularly interested in, as I said, the meanings that we're embedded in living our lives. Other sociologists might look at large statistical agglomerations of, say, different populations, and there's a lot you can get about interrelationships from that, or they might look at networks, regardless of whether we know they're there or not. But I'm particularly interested in the meaning part of sociology. So cultural sociology is about those meanings. So to put it in like things, in terms of things that we study, we might study rituals, like, say, graduations, or symbols, like, say, the flag, or values, evaluations, like who do we think is better, higher status, or worse than ourselves. So ritual, symbols, values, norms, they're a little bit more unfamiliar maybe, but they're the taken for granted things that we need to operate in our social worlds. There's always a lot that's taken it for granted about how we function. And then also categories, how do we divide up the world? So all those things are bits of culture that I'm interested in.
Right. And so you emphasize that the sort of meaning making that you're concerned with is fundamentally a social and a public sort of meaning in these interrelations rather than just in the individual. This makes a lot of sense to me. I think personally, one of the ways that my thinking has really evolved over the past decade or so is to appreciate that humans are really obligately social. And that gets to, as you say, humans are meaning-making creatures, and meaning is an essential component of all human groups and human actions. It's really very ubiquitous. How do you view the relationship between this these interrelations and individual meaning, or what's going on inside our heads individually? Yeah.
In terms of individuals, you can certainly learn a lot through looking at psychological processes, but from my point of view, and as when you think in the sociology frame, like the genre of sociology, you're always interested in the impact of the interrelationships on those psychological processes. It's not that they're not there and everybody has their individuality, but what has been the impact of the small-scale social processes, like we're having this discussion here, to families and institutions like that, family and religion, to big things in history. All of those things change people, and we're interested in that side. So it's not incompatible to be interested in individual processes, but we're particularly interested in how all those interrelationships are forming the individual.
Right. It's worth mentioning the title for today's event comes from a quotation from C. Wright Mills that you brought up with me. C. Wright Mills, a sociologist of the 40s and 50s, he says, "The sociological imagination enables us to group history and biography and the relation between the two within society." So, indeed, understanding sort of the social milieu in which the individual processes are happening and how
And let me add, you can learn a lot by the way, thanks for C. Wright Mills' quote. That one quote, "The sociological imagination is beloved by all sociologists," and I love it that you titled this way. It reminds us that doing some sort of inquiry like sociology does take a sort of imagination in the same way I think that art does. But I wanted to mention also that one thing sociology can tell us is that different social groups, at different times in history, people can be more individualistic or less individualistic. And in fact, how individual you can be is often shaped by your surrounding social circumstances.
Right. And maybe I want to ask about in the modern day, maybe in America, how people in the public sort of respond to this idea. It seems in America, in particular, there's this notion of sort of rugged individualism that I might think could make people sort of hostile to the idea that social forces really have anything to do with them. They want to see themselves as really determining their own lives. Do you encounter that sort of skepticism among the public ever?
I think that's one reason why perhaps, say, psychology is more well known than sociology. But I think that it's not only American. In fact, a famous sociologist going back in the day, one of our founders said that modern societies create this sense of individuality, in part because we're all doing so many different things. So when I was, and so that's something, that's a switch you make when you're thinking with the sociological imagination. My very first sociology class, long ago, intro to sociology, back in Australia, also, not only America, the professor said, we all come into this field thinking ourselves only as individuals, or maybe shaped by family, but thinking of ourselves only as individuals. And the switch you make, he did like by doing readings on all the different parts of our lives and how they fit into society. The switch you make when you use sociological imagination is to switch out of thinking in terms of that individual process to look at all the relations surrounding us.
Right. And indeed, it seems somehow people are very often blind to this. I mean, you say in your book, meaning making is like breathing, and we don't notice the air around us. And indeed, it seems very difficult for many people to sort of step outside their own cultural context, and rather than just viewing what they know as normal, maybe the way things should be, to understand, at least at some level, that there's a social construction going on around them. Why is that so difficult for many, if not all, people?
Well, I don't think it's surprising. And in fact, if you're thinking about all the different cultural possibilities all the time, it'd be hard to get through the day, right? You have to take some things for granted to get on with your life. But I think at the same time, we all encounter moments where you might have a sort of culture shock, or suddenly you're startled to see something different to what you assumed. So when I'm talking to students about this, I ask them to think about some moment when they encountered people doing something differently that surprised them, or they went to a different place and that startled their assumptions in some way. And everybody has these experiences, and in a way, that's what we build on. Well, you know, that was it. Were they sort of symbolizing marriage in a different way, say, or did they have some symbol that you didn't know what it meant, and you had to ask? That's a simple thing. Or they might have totally different evaluations, totally different way of thinking about, say, education or something. So you have to really understand where people are coming from, and we all have those culture shocks one way or another sometime, and so that's where we start.
Right. It seems to drive home to me the importance of multiculturalism. I think personally, for me, I was only started being more aware of culture informing what I was doing when I went to college and met people from all around the world who did do many things in very, very different ways. Does sociology, is there a lot of study of multiculturalism within societies? How, you know, whether people are partaking in a single sort of shared social media, or doing their own things even as they live side by side?
Yes, it's a sort of question that a lot of sociologists are interested in different ways. And earlier generations of sociologists who are interested in culture did more or less work on the assumption that there would be some fundamentally shared symbols and values across a group, across a society. That's been challenged a lot, and now I think generally a lot of research has shown that while there are certainly some shared touchstones that people can recognise within, say, this subculture, we have some shared touchstones, or within American society we have some shared touchstones, or within, say, Notre Dame, there's some shared recognition of symbols. At the same time, people's interpretations can be quite variant, and they may have different things in what we think of as their cultural repertoire. So now the standard view of culture is much more emphasising that there's a lot of difference within a group.
Interesting. If I can change the topic, since between us we're melding the social and physical sciences, I wanted to ask about human sociology in the context of humans having evolved over the past tens of millions of years as social primates. And does this explain what we talked about culture being ubiquitous and crucial for humans, and meaning making being so crucial? And is it useful practically for sociologists to keep this perspective in mind? Does it actually practically inform about sociology?
I think it's a fundamental condition to recognise that we are social creatures, yes, and in fact symbol-using creatures. That's a fundamental condition. So sometimes, for instance, people might say that, we have there's a fundamental universal human nature, so all this cultural variation, that's not getting at the real thing about humans. But in answer to that, sociologists would say, well, the real thing about humans is that we are these social meaning-making creatures. That's our human nature, and that's what creates all the possibility of this huge variation in society. So yes, it's really fundamental to know that that's our essential human nature. If I could go a step further though, I think that we don't think that's the end, that's only the beginning. And to reduce it to that would be to leave out most of what we know of sociology. In particular, a big difference between us and other creatures, which we can see sort of a little bit meaning-making, like in Jane Goodall just died recently, and she studied meaning-making basically in chimp subcultures. The big difference for humans is just the amazing differentiation and proliferation in history of this really basic skill, and the way that we have turned into agricultural societies and then bigger empires and nation states, and all those, that social differentiation means that we can't just stick with saying, oh, we're social creatures like a primate.
Sure. Right, yeah. Certainly, limiting your study of humanity to the human genome would be foolish and would not get at many of the things that make us humans.
But it's a fundamental.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, including, these cultural factors are, as you say, largely to credit for human development over the past few hundred thousands or millions of years, right? I mean, just starting by the development of stone tools and being able to teach these techniques that indeed were different in different areas.
Yes.
Being able to teach those techniques to others and to our children, obviously incredibly crucial to the story of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, as to non-human animals, I have been very part of my appreciation for, as I alluded, for humans being obligately social creatures did come out of this evolutionary history for me. And so I've been very interested to read over the years, to hear about studies of culture in non-human animals. And I guess in that context, well, looking around at the literature briefly, it seems that this subject is largely, if not entirely, in other departments than sociology. I think I see this coming out of anthropology departments or just bio departments. Do you think there should be some sociological perspective, or is there work on the sociological view of culture in non-human animals as well?
I would say mostly not, although sociology is such a prolific field.
Yeah.
In some way you'll find something. Where you see animals being important is in a few different ways. The one I'm thinking of right now is a new set of research questions, basically, about human-animal interactions,
Sure.
and just even, just at a very common sense level, how human-animal interactions are created in humans' heads, in
Sure.
families. We all know from our pets, and how they affect humans. So there is certainly studies of that, but as far as like applying a sociology to, say, like a chimp band or something like that, occasionally, like I've seen a paper I'm thinking of that looks at a behavioural study of a chimp band which recognises some ritualistic factors that we also see in humans. Some sort of ritual that we might think of as proto-religion. But in general, that is not our main focus. And that's because sociology really started with the transition from traditional small-scale societies to large-scale industrial societies with industry and democracy coming in. So as the division of, as we move from small bands to the huge networks that we operate in today up to global, that's the sort of crucial change that sociology originates in.
I see. So, interesting. I guess in some of these other fields, I think they talk about culture more in the sense of just social learning. Is that, do you get into arguments with anthropologists that or sociologists? Is there tension there, or just these are different aspects of culture that these fields study?
I think different aspects. We're perfectly happy for people to have different perspectives and develop those perspectives. Social learning is just, like I said, the starting point of all the multiple things that processes of meaning making that we can study and the variation we see. It's a good starting point. There's something else I was going to say there. There's a lot of overlaps between cultural sociology and anthropology in other aspects. But it's escaping me. I had some other point. But
Okay, they're totally fine. All very interesting. Another topic that I wanted to make sure we get to is about aesthetics. In your book, you make the point, which resonated a lot with me. You make the point that very often aesthetic values are linked to some moral judgment. And embarrassingly, indeed, I recall as a teenager, it felt like the sort of music that others or that I listened to had some deep importance, and there was some sense of judgment, moral judgment there. And thinking more broadly, it seems very often cultural revolutions, cultural changes are led by changes in music or in art, more generally defined. So why is this so? Why are these aesthetic ideas of meaning making so particularly important in our lives?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're not alone in, especially when you're young, thinking of your music or whatever as really representing something important in the world. And if people didn't get that, there was something wrong with them.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
More generally, there's been a whole lot of interesting different work on how people's tastes, we think of taste as a very personal factor, again, to go back to where we started, but if you do the research, you find a lot of social systematic patterns in people's tastes. So people's tastes are often linked in all sorts of ways to their social background. So because your taste is actually, you experience it as individual, but actually it's much more
Sure.
influenced by your surroundings. Because of that, it becomes an element by which you assess other people, for sure. Like you might want to be, you might think avant-garde is most important and be pretty contemptuous of something pop or something like that.
Right. Right, and I guess in this context, we'd be remiss not to mention that I think jazz is often seen as sort of an out-group, right? And certainly I've experienced this in telling other people that I enjoy coming here so much. Has there been interesting work in cultural sociology on jazz in particular, on the people, the categories of people who appreciate or engage musically with jazz?
Oh, now you've got me.
I'm
I'm absolutely sure it's there because there's an enormous research interest in musical tastes and in different genres in relation to the social surroundings. I actually don't know the specific findings with respect to jazz, but I will say that, for instance, a friend of mine actually from when I was training in grad school studied how jazz moved in the 20th century from being considered a more sort of pop culture to being considered art. And the sorts of industry and artistic processes which made that transition. Now, I think it's certainly categorized much more as a sort of more high art than pop, and for that reason, it becomes a more niche, maybe niche taste, for
Right.
sure.
I see. And maybe more generally, is there some more general takeaway for people who engage with niche aesthetics? And some people many people, of course, are very happy to go along with mainstream. Totally fine. I no longer morally judge those people. Are there correlations among the type of people who search for avant-garde or generally non-mainstream art? I'm asking you very specific questions and you're not able to consult the literature in real time, I understand.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, just the generalization would be, to some degree, have maybe either a deep musical background from early on, or just generally higher education and Yeah. So,
Interesting.
so the big variation in people's musical tastes is actually not between sort of art and popular culture, but sort of more educated people will say they like everything, sort of, or they're interested in everything, and less educated people will have like one main thing that they're interested in.
Maybe I've been listening to too much CHATS.
No, I mean, that doesn't mean to say you might not like an art form especially, but you'll tell me, oh, I like everything really, you know, just because so that sort of, so education is actually a really big marker of whether you say, oh, I'm an omnivore, I like everything, or else you just stick with one thing. Yeah.
I see, and is that sort of, is the reasoning there sort of along the lines of just being exposed to this sort of multiculturalism, being exposed to different things and appreciating that what you were raised with particularly isn't the only thing out there, the only thing of value? Is that sort of the
Yeah, I think it is partly exposure, but then the more general exposure goes along with, like, you were going to college and you heard different sorts of music or whatever like that. Yeah, it's partly exposure, but also partly as a more general cultural norm in Western societies in the last few decades, it becomes more respected to not be judgmental and say, oh, I only like opera. So it's considered to be more moral, to be more inclusive. And so even if you don't actually like, heavy metal or something, you say, oh, this is an interesting piece of heavy metal, because you don't want to be exclusionary. So
I see. Interesting. Yeah. I need to think more about that. Yeah.
Something that I would add, and this is moving away from people's aesthetic taste specifically, but there's some really interesting findings about genre forms. And this woman studied probably 150 different musical genres and subgenres and ended up finding that they followed 4 different patterns. One might be in terms of the communities surrounding them, one might be avant-garde, one might be like a scene, a sort of either local or online, like we're a scene, I think, where we're interacting around a particular musical focus.
Right.
Then of course there's mass industry genre forms, and there's traditionalist, where you want to preserve a particular sort of music, and that's a little bit, I think, what we're doing here as well. And the interesting thing was she found like jazz moving through, or maybe being in these different forms at different times, so going from maybe pop to traditionalist, more mass culture to traditionalist, or the avant-garde to scene to mass to traditionalist. But you can do that with all different sorts of music as well. So this is, I find, a really useful way of thinking about different sorts of groups surrounding music and affecting its production.
Interesting. And with jazz, as you say, there's this element of traditionalism because of when jazz originally became quite popular. But it seems like there's still quite an element of avant-garde as well. People are still pushing the envelope, as we get to see often here with the great acts that the Merrimans bring in.
Yes.
So, okay, an interesting hybrid of sitting between some of those.
In a way, I think that's keeping jazz alive. So you have these avant-garde, maybe borderline sorts of musicians and artists, but there's still the traditionalist sort of, so that we know some core traditions within jazz, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. And it does seem like it's there is some stratification as well, in that many places you hear jazz, some bar, you don't get so much of the avant-garde elements. People want to hear, I guess, more traditional things that they know. This is sort of a quite niche environment that we all benefit from here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to ask, I mean, something I try to ask everyone I talk to here, sort of a bigger question. How has your study of cultural sociology, or more generally your empirical study of the world, affected how you personally view the earth, or yourself, or society, or maybe how you engage with culture for yourself?
Yeah. It's almost, this is like one of those, you don't know the air you're breathing moments. In a way. It's hard to think without it now. I've been in it so long. But I do think that I always want to think about what's not being thought about, like some influences behind a person or in what they know that make them the way they are, perhaps. I always want to know how the surrounding, what we don't know about the conditions and constraints on making something run, like what are the real pressures on an organisation, maybe like this, maybe like some business, maybe like some school, that I, as an outsider, don't really understand, and it would be interesting to know about, and that would explain. So I guess it's always like putting questions in my head about, and I guess the one exception to that, or one of the few, is when I come to Merriman's, where I usually just take off that hat and I just like do, oh, I don't have to think about that right.
Sorry for colliding.
So this is a different, so you're seeing me with a different hat on. Yeah, but I think always, like, there's always these extra questions I've got as I go through life, or particular sort of questions.
Right. And yeah, I guess at this point, over your entire career, these ideas have been very embedded in how you think about things. Maybe going back to the beginning, actually, how did you get interested in sociology? How did you find yourself now a professor emeritus of sociology?
Well, the very, very beginning. My grandmother lived on some land outside a small town in the southwest of Australia. It was a coal mining town, actually. And in her front room, there was piles of books. I don't actually know how most of them got there. There was a lot of, like, I don't know if anybody knows Georgette Hare romances and things like that. So when I visited my grandmother, I'd zip through these books. In those piles of books, there was an old book from the 30s or 40s called Elements of Sociology. And I took a look at that. I still don't know how it got there, because none of them was academic. I took a look at that, and it had like a chapter on the family, and a chapter on religion, and a chapter on this, and a chapter on that. And I just thought it was super, super interesting, and it gave me this whole new perspective that I'd never really thought about before. And then, like, much later, so I did sociology classes in college, and by that time I was totally sold, and I just went ahead and I wanted to do it forever. But that just goes to show you don't know what a book is going to do. Right? It's amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. And over your career, has the way that people conceptualize cultural society, cultural sociology, changed? Is this you open your book with some history of cultural sociology, and it seems like the modern view of what culture is, how people make meaning, is something that a lot of which has developed over your career, or do I have the
As a subfield, it's really come together and cohered. I've been very, very lucky that when I first started grad school and from then on, before that, it was very, it wasn't a coherent subfield. People, of course, did these topics like study music or study interaction processes like we're having or whatever, but it wasn't a coherent field, but people wanted that to change, and I went into sociology studies wanting that to change, and so in my decades in the field it has cohered as a subfield, so that's been really interesting. So now when the young students come in, or not young students but like first year grad students, they think it's been there forever, and I have to tell them, no, this body of work that is our tradition has actually been put together in my working life.
Right.
You know? So that's pretty cool too, to have seen that.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. Very must be a very cool sort of academic experience. Lived through it, and of course contributed to that.
Although when people think, oh, it's been there forever, and I sort of think, and I think it's sort of boring, and let's do something new. I think no, it's still really interesting.
Right. So then maybe you're an especially good person, having lived through this development of a field, to ask a broad question about what takeaways you think there are, what practical lessons you think that all of us should learn from cultural sociology. Is it just a deep appreciation of the importance of the social milieu, or are there other lessons that people should really take away?
I think an awareness of the many different ways that humans can be human.
Yes.
In healthy and wonderful and creative ways, that there's not only one essential way of being, and to be, I don't mean morally relativist, but to be cognitively relativist about what humans are and what they can do. Yeah. So I think that's important.
Yeah, you're definitely an important lesson. Thank you. Maybe this would be a good time to take some questions. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
I would like you to talk a little about the lack of meaning in young people especially.
Yes.
So the question is about the lack of meaning.
Yes.
Yes.
I see so much.
Yes.
For
Yes.
For young people in particular, yes.
Yes. That is also a major topic of interest, and to the extent that we haven't really talked about how sociology has a lot to analyze about social problems and to
Sure.
contribute to the analysis of social problems, but that is certainly an important one. And so one of the founders of cultural sociology was particularly concerned about that, and he talked about anomie, lack of meaning, and when that arises. A lot of it has to do. So how did he think about that? He says, Russ, maybe you could help me here. Russ teaches this as well. He ties different patterns of anomie to different forms of integration into social groups. So when a social group like young people experiences sort of meaninglessness or lack of norms, and what Durkheim would have called anomie, it's because the bonds, their bonds into social groups have frayed in different ways. So we can see that now, and of course people always talk about how the impact of social media has changed, especially young people's forms of integration into what were pretty taken for granted social groups. And in some ways that can be strengthening. They might like get into some sort of online scene and get interested in jazz or whatever. They can certainly strengthen social bonds, but in many cases, young people's anomie can be attributed to the sort of huge upheaval in ways of making social bonds that we're not through yet. So that's the first start. People are interested in studying that a lot. Yeah. Is that the sort of thing you're asking?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking how sad it is that we've lost our connection to the earth
Yes.
and to each other, and so many of the indigenous cultures have still preserved that. So their young people would have a deeper sense of meaning because they're part of the group, and you're about to, if they ask someone, you meet someone and you say, how are you?
Yeah.
They don't say, I'm fine, they say, we are well, or we are not well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly that sense of being connected, and it's really sad that we, in this culture, do not have that sense of being part of the other.
It's always a danger of the sort of expansion of modernity that those links get frayed. Yeah. I think they can be reconstructed and sometimes are.
Saying that,
Mm.
we hope and pray they can.
I think they are certainly. Yeah, but that's certainly you've honed in on one of the big drivers of one of our of sociology to ask questions about anomie. Yeah.
In the origins
Yes,
of
Russ, thank you.
the origins of sociology, the pioneer referred to Neil Durkheim. He started out very optimistic that social change is not destructive, that societies change and people can adapt to that. As time went on, he became more and more concerned and worried that people weren't being able to adapt to the social changes in their societies. And he then, at the last part of his life and career, he devoted himself to trying to figure out how we could correct that
Yeah.
and make life make sense to people in ways that they could then find a satisfactory life.
I want to introduce my lovely husband Russ, who is also a sociologist and has taught this very recently and knows so much about it. Thank you.
Right, it seems like part of the promise of, you might have thought the promise of the internet, say, the internet age, is to facilitate connection between different groups strewn across the planet who otherwise might not have been able to ever connect. But indeed, somehow it seems like instead it's contributed to fractionalization even, the very opposite. Is that, do you think that's a problem with the current implementation of what's going on the internet in particular? Was this promise ever of really connecting us? Should we have hoped for that? Was it reasonable to hope for?
I think these things, new forms of communication are always double-edged. We tend at the moment to deplore the way internet communications have frayed social connection, and especially that has happened by changing norms about what can be said, what's polite, what you keep backstage, what is up front stage. So those norms are all in flux, and that's fraying social connections. At the same time, I think that this isn't over, and we can also point to many forms of positive and new social connection which are available, which weren't available before. And they have perhaps been life-saving at various times for some people. So I think we have to see these things as always double-edged, and our research questions should be what's happening in this particular setting and why, and how can we change norms to improve the positive effects of new forms of communication and reduce the negative effects. Another thing I see here is the increasing expansion of connections also means that there's more differentiated small groups, so that as a fan of Coltrane, say, or something, you can be exposed to a whole subculture of people who talk about that all the time and know about that all the time. So you get more of these possibilities of small groups as well. So I think that's a positive.
Yeah. Interesting. There was a question back there. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the question, it's observation. You talked about in the beginning symbols and meaning, and that these could be cultural symbols that are traditions, rituals, or they could be little physical things that they mean. And it made me think, when we try to distinguish, we're talking also about animals, and when we think about the development of humans, that other hominids had left some evidence that they also had some idea of symbols and things. But the most elaborate symboling system we have, of course, is our language.
Yes.
Which in every single word, there's a meaning behind it.
Yes.
And it made me think, when you say meaning, I'm thinking of all the invisible, hidden things, but we want to make them manifest somehow. Is that the right, am I taking the right thing from you?
Yeah, although I think it's really important what you say about language as being almost underpinning or at least analogous to culture as a whole. Because language is essentially a public capacity before we can have private languages. And so too is culture something public, as you say. It's sort of not, it has to be public in a way. It has to be something out there that you can understand or I can understand for it to be culture, for it to be language. But what this public good does for us, whether it's language or there are other bits of you could think of culture also in not so much linguistic, but in some objects, as you say, or in taken for granted norms like back and forth speech. So culture is a little bit broader than language, but you can say that yes, for sure, this is the set of processes, this is the capacity which makes us more than just interior. I'm not sure, is that what you're getting at?
I think so, but what I wonder is why we select some things than others. And it's, I think, there's something that makes us feel good just to talk to one another, or to share things back and forth, to share a meal, to have a religious, once a week you go and you all perform the ritual together.
Yes.
It just makes us feel good.
Yes, absolutely. That's because that's our human nature, I would say.
Yeah. This notion of us as obligately social.
Yeah.
And so that's what gives value to these things.
But absolutely.
Yes.
But then you can think, well, but like this religious ritual is different to this religious ritual, and how do those things come about? So you can develop questions then on that basis, if you see what I mean?
Yes, well, you talked a little earlier about creativity, and I think languages morph daily for many reasons. our rituals do too. There's no limit to the number of languages we can invent, or the number of symbols, or the number of rituals. And we just infuse them with some sort of meaning that we try and either pass down or exchange with others. And it's not as if anyone controls it. It's, as you say, this whole cultural thing sort of moving along and just dynamically changing over time. Your talk is just, I'm gonna run right out and get your book. It's sparked things that I haven't thought about. And,
I told you, it's so cool.
this is just such an enjoyable hour that I spend with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, maybe that's a good place to call it then, on a very positive note. Thank you so much, well, to everyone for coming. Thank you so much to Lyn.
Thank you for being here. I can talk about what I really care about here.
Yeah, and I wanted to also thank Lyn and Russ for the generous support of this event, which is really what enabled us to put this on.